I'm going to be talking to Duane Bratt, who's a political science professor at the Mount Royal University. We're going to talk about will be happening in Canada in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk and a slew of political developments at the federal level in the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, and so on. It's a madhouse down there. Welcome to the interview, Duane.
Hey, happy to be here, Markham, but this is not going to be a fun topic.
No, it's not. So why don't we dive right in and give me your take on what's going on south of the border?
Craziness is setting for it. Almost the moment that I heard about Charlie Kirk being shot, and this was before he died, I said, this is going to have major repercussions. Kirk is a big figure in conservative politics in the United States and is very closely aligned to the Trump administration. He's good friends with J.D. Vance, with Don Jr. He played an influential role in the 2024 campaign. And when he was killed, now you're seeing that backlash occur. And the initial one was, we're going to go after anybody who celebrated his death. Then it's become, we're going to go after anyone who may not have celebrated his death, but criticized some aspects of Charlie Kirk. And you're using the phrases, or you're hearing the phrases, they did this, they did that. And whenever you start using comments like they and those people, it is so vague. Who do they mean? Well, we're starting to get more meat on the bone. They're talking about progressive organizations. They're talking about law firms. They're talking about funding foundations. Everything is linked back to George Soros, but there's all sorts of organizations on the left, right, and center that fund things. You're even hearing references to the Democratic Party, and there is going to be a witch hunt, and we're already seeing that. And they're extending it, as I said, not necessarily to people celebrating, but to say, hey, yeah, Charlie Kirk was more than just this guy who went on campuses and says, please debate me. He was also one who created a watch list of professors that led to doxing and harassment and death threats. He is one who denied the 2020 election, who has argued that any successful Black woman was solely due to affirmative action. There has been a whitewashing of Kirk's record and a silencing of even discussing that. So for a number of people who were absolutely opposed to cancel culture, they have really picked up the mantle of counterculture, or of cancel culture. And I'm worrying that the full weight of the state is going to come bigger. I mean, we're just seeing reports about the Department of Justice deleting studies that it has done in the past, looking at right-wing violence versus left-wing violence. This is not going to go well in the United States.
I interviewed Professor Matthew Bodie from the University of North Georgia today. He was one of the first professors put on that academics watch list. And he is comfortable with calling it Christian nationalism, the ideology, I guess, or that Kirk espoused. But you have a different take on that.
Yeah, there's a better term, and that's what's called conservative nationalism, and it's looking at movements across the world. Viktor Orban in Hungary is a good illustration of that. Nigel Farage and Marine Le Pen in France and Britain are examples of that. Donald Trump has that in spades. And it goes beyond religion to include all other aspects. So traditionally, we talked about, what did conservatives want? They wanted limited government. They wanted free expression. They wanted free markets. That's not what we're seeing with conservative nationalism. They actually want a large government that will intervene into the economy to certain people's benefit and oppose other people's benefit. They want to champion some free expression, but not other forms of free expression. And there is obviously a religious element to it, but it's larger than that. There's an anti-immigrant stream. There's a family value stream. So they may actually accept some other religions if those other religions actually promote some of the same ideas that they want. And I think that's a better term because it really flips conservatism on its head.
Duane, you're located in Calgary, and Alberta has been kind of the epicenter of this movement. Um, what are we to make? Are you seeing already some reactions in Alberta to Kirk's assassination?
Not to the degree that we're seeing in the United States. There was comments made in Parliament yesterday when Parliament opened, and there was a standing ovation, and people have been playing that as if they were giving a standing ovation to Charlie Kirk and the ideas that he represented. And that motion came forward from an Alberta MP, but I took it more as the expression of free expression, right? That you should be allowed to say what you want and believe what you want without getting yourself killed. And I think we could all applaud that. Applauding the legacy of Charlie Kirk, that's a lot more complex because I would not be doing that. I did not want to see him killed. I think that was completely wrong, and we are seeing that being punished. But he also had a lot of atrocious ideas. He had some really positive ideas and positive messages and was clearly influential and was a major political figure. But let's not just whitewash what he was about. I don't think we're seeing that in Canada. There's usually a lag of these ideas coming into Canada from the United States. I think Alberta is a bit different. And the reason I say that, if we put the Kirk killing on the shelf and look at what else is going on in Alberta, you see some of these elements of conservative nationalism. So there's always been this wonder, if Danielle Smith used to be a conservative and used to be a libertarian, why is she cracking down on municipalities? Why is she cracking down on police forces? Why is she going after vulnerable communities like trans children? Why is she bringing in book bans? Why is she now demanding that we put citizenship on driver's licenses? And I think the explanation is it fits into conservative nationalism. It is using the weight of the state to pursue its goals, even if it's outside of their jurisdiction, right? And so I'm sure the Kirk impact will be seen more in the days and weeks and months to come. But right now, it's more about what he represented, and he was clearly a conservative nationalist.
Now, my understanding is there was a lot of back and forth between the Canadian conservative nationalists and those in the United States. And a lot of it takes place on channels that we would never, frequent.
Yeah.
Telegram, 4chan, Rumble, which is based out of Toronto. And so given the fact that Alberta was the birthplace of the Freedom Convoy and the birthplace, it has Take Back Alberta and so on, is the networking between the US groups and the Alberta groups much greater than other provinces? What's your take?
Oh, absolutely. There's much greater American influence amongst conservatives in Alberta than in other provinces. They exist elsewhere, but it's not just the convoys and the truckers. You look at in the spring, where was Danielle Smith speaking to? Breitbart, Ben Shapiro. And that's why I say you need to be careful about the Christian element, because Ben Shapiro is Jewish. And there's a clear alignment between conservative Jews, not liberal Jews, but conservative Jews and Christians and conservative Muslims, those that attack their own faith, for example. Those are part of the club. You're welcomed in. And we saw that in Alberta when there was this, million march for children. Well, it wasn't a million people, and it wasn't really for children. What it was a march to attack transgender and gay children. And that was coordinated between David Parker, who is a Christian fundamentalist, and some very conservative Muslim clerics, right? And those have had an influence on the Smith government.
What are we to make of Danielle Smith? There was a memorial in Edmonton, and Smith went on X and said some positive things about Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, and she seems to fit in her own way into that category of conservative nationalism.
I think so. Just because you have sympathy for Erica Kirk, I have sympathy for Erica Kirk and her children. Right? She was in Utah when it happened. So yes, anytime you look at the widow and the children, there is a degree of sympathy for them. You'd be heartless not to. But we still need to have a better reckoning of Kirk's entire record. But Smith herself, yes, fits absolutely with that. And I think that is where we're starting to see things. Now, whether she came about that evolution on her own, because she used to be a libertarian and a small marketeer and has drifted into this grouping, or whether she is following the parade that we're seeing as well. And if we look, so yesterday, there was a major announcement that they're going to require citizenship on your driver's license. And they link it to, well, it's just simple to have all of your ID information all on one card. Eventually, they're going to include healthcare information on there. What's the connection between driving and being a citizen and healthcare status? That still hasn't been made clear to me. But then they made two other references. And reference one was about election integrity. We have really robust elections, and they're free and fair, and there's very little evidence of any sort of malfeasance. But there is a belief that they have been stolen, or that you've got immigrants voting or people voting more than one time. And it's really ramped up since 2020. Well, why is that? Because Donald Trump has been claiming the 2020 election has been stolen. So now they're going to require photo ID to vote. Well, the problem with photo ID is that doesn't show citizenship. So now they've got that on there. They got rid of ballot counting machines. Why? Because Trump has attacked voting machines. Well, there's a difference between ballot counting and voting machines. So there's that element. And then finally, the issue around immigration. The Alberta Next panel is looking at 6 areas. One involves immigration. There is an entire video put out by the government saying that Alberta may have to remove social services, education, healthcare, whatever those are, to immigrants if they don't meet Alberta values. Well, how can you prove citizenship? Going to school or going to a hospital? You put it on the driver's license.
Duane, I'm getting some feedback from our audience, which skews older. A lot of them are 55 plus, and they're worried about maybe their kids, maybe their grandchildren being radicalized. And that it was a big theme in the interviews I did with American experts. Charlie Kirk was part of a mission to radicalize youth. What's happening in Alberta on that front?
Well, it's interesting because Kirk's critique, and this has actually been extenuated since his death, is that universities and colleges are the ones radicalizing him. That Tyler Robinson, the man who's been charged with killing Kirk, was radicalized because he grew up in a nice, easy, Mormon, gun-loving, Trump-loving, conservative-loving, Republican-loving family. But then he went to university for a semester and he completely switches sides. That puts a lot of power on professors. I can't even get them to read the syllabus, let alone change their entire political identity in 3 or 4 months. But that's the viewpoint. And so what Kirk was trying to do was almost a counter radicalization, particularly amongst white young men. And he was very successful at doing that. I will say my students were completely aware of Charlie Kirk. That didn't mean they agreed with him, but they knew who he was and they knew what he represented. And there are people who supported his ideas and others that were repelled, but they knew who he was. There's no equivalent figure in Canada like him. And people have tried, and they simply haven't been able to replicate that.
Final question, Duane. There's a big connection between the conservative nationalism in Alberta and pro-oil populism. Maybe you could talk about that for a bit.
Well, you just have to look at the linkages between the American oil industry and the Alberta oil industry. And that goes back to Turner Valley in 1914, to Leduc in 1947, and on and on and on. It has adjusted immigration patterns. So where has American immigration come to Canada? Some of the most conservative areas of the country, like Texas, like Oklahoma. So there is a clear connection there. But they used to be to government, stay out of our way, free marketeers and all of that. Well, now they want bigger government. They still want government to stay out of their affairs, but they want to go after their enemies list in the environmental movement and amongst Indigenous people that oppose resource development. So there is a linkage there, and they want to use government as a hammer against groups that they don't like. And we saw that with things like the Allen Inquiry and Jason Kenney's fight back strategy. So there is a connection there. And there's always been a connection between the American oil sector and the Canadian oil sector.
I do have one actual final question. And I interviewed a couple of years ago retired professor Trish Roberts Miller about authoritarian libertarianism. And her way to describe that is you can be as free as you want, maximum freedom, as long as it's freedom we agree with. And if we don't agree with your freedom, we will use the power of the state to make you comply. And that seems to be, I know we're throwing away terms here or throwing around terms, but that is, her point was that's been a part of the American political scene for like 400 years. And it just bubbles up every once in a while.
Yeah, and so that term is not inconsistent with conservative nationalism, but it doesn't get at the motivation. It talks about the tool, but it doesn't talk about the motivation. And I think that's where conservative nationalism comes in.
Great. Well, Duane, enlightening as always. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, you're welcome, Markham.